Welcome to A Healthy Curiosity, the podcast that explores what it takes to be well in a busy world with self-care strategies from Chinese medicine. I'm your host, Brodie Welch, here to support you on your journey of health, happiness, and personal evolution. Welcome to A Healthy Curiosity. My guest today is LaShelle Lowe-Chardé, and we're going to be talking about healthy relationships through compassionate communication, empathy, and boundaries. Compassionate communication is a style of communicating when the intention is to connect. And this form of communicating changed my life, both professionally and personally, when I first learned about it. And I thought I was already a pretty good communicator. So I'm super excited to have an expert on the subject here to unpack a lot of the central concepts of compassionate communication, especially empathy and boundaries. I hope that you get a lot out of this conversation. I know that I will. And LaShelle, thanks so much for joining us today.
Sure. Thank you for having me.
LaShelle is a certified trainer in compassionate communication, and she has been for 10 years. She holds a master's degree in psychology, and she's worked as a trainer for the past 15 years. She brings a deep relationship to mindfulness practice that she's cultivated through many years of Zen practice and training in Hakomi, which is body-centered mindfulness-based therapy. So LaShelle, you have integrated various parts of your life, your mindfulness practice in with your work. Could you talk a little bit about that relationship?
Yeah, I'm practicing Buddhist for many years. Cultivating mindfulness is a major part of that practice. And it's so deeply related to compassionate communication in that compassionate communication is asking us to be mindful about how we are communicating and what impact our communication is having on others, and also communicating with ourselves.
Absolutely. If the point of communication is to express something or to receive something from someone else, we have to make sure that we're communicating in a way where that is heard and received in the way that we're intending, and that we are receiving what's being told to us in the way that it's meant. I heard the other day that the most common outcome of a conversation is a misunderstanding. I don't actually know if that's grounded in facts, but it sounds like it could be suspiciously true that we often think we're communicating something and we're not really. For people who aren't familiar with compassionate communication, aka nonviolent communication or NVC, could you walk us through some of the basics? What is the central tenet of NVC and what are the parts?
Mm-hmm. The most central principle is that when we can cultivate a particular quality of connection with another person, we naturally access a giving from the heart and a sense of creativity and flexibility that allows us to meet everyone's needs in a given situation. So often when I say that, people get caught because the most common thing that blocks our ability to have everyone's needs met is the idea that they all have to be met in the same moment.
The concept of time is taken out.
Yeah. The stickiest strategy is the concept of time.
So the idea that we all have the same basic needs and all human beings need to be seen and heard and valued and loved and have basic health and things like that. Recognizing that even if you seem to be on opposite sides of a particular issue, being able to bring it back to the commonality and be able to connect with someone else on the basis of you have this need too somewhere, thereby eliciting a sympathy or an understanding in another person is, I think it can be really transformative for people who tend to be conflict averse. You know, that there is a tendency of like, oh, I can't speak up about this particular issue because I don't want to rock the boat. I don't want to make someone mad. Mm-hmm. And yet a lot of times that is precisely doing that is what's necessary to open up a lot more ease in the relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Do you find that to be true?
Absolutely. And you're naming the other most important principle that MVC or compassionate communication brings, which is this idea of universal needs. And it's an incredibly unique idea. I've worked with many frameworks, and I haven't found it so fully as it is in this framework. So this idea that everything we do and say is coming from an attempt to meet a need or be in harmony with a need, or you could use the word value, then opens up, like you're saying, this channel for connection that if we're only caught in the content of things, in the way we do things or what we want to have happen, we don't have access to. But if I can come down to, oh, you'd like me to come to your family's dinner because you have a need for companionship and support, rather than let's argue about how many dinners we've gone to or not gone to. It's incredible in the way it can open up a place of negotiation and creating harmony and collaboration.
And in the example that you just gave, it's not about keeping score of we've gone to X number of social gatherings that you've wanted to go to and only this number for me. That the need for companionship and support may be met differently for different people, right? Like
Right.
we all have those basic needs, but the way that they're translated can look really different.
Yeah. And that usually takes some getting used to as people are learning in this framework. This whole idea that you and I could have the same need and meet it in completely different ways really requires some separation between the need and the strategy we have to meet it.
That notion of do unto others as you would have them do unto you kind of falls apart in the sense that it's really like as they would have you do unto them. Because
Right.
we are really different in that way. So this seems to be where I'd like for you to tell me a little bit about empathy, because empathy does help to create a sense of connection and a sense that someone is really understanding your experience. But if we are so different, how do we get to empathy? And what is empathy? And what isn't empathy? I'd love for you to unpack that a little bit for us.
Sure. The most simple way to define empathy is a willingness to become curious about another person's experience.
The willingness to be curious about another person's experience. So they express something and you could ask them, you could guess at the feeling or guess at their experience?
Yeah. So, and I think it's important with defining empathy to separate out an action from, we could say, a state of consciousness. So one of the things I see with students of NVC is that they can go through the actions, but they don't have the consciousness. So then their attempts to give empathy get rejected or criticized, and, they're creating more suffering for themselves and others. So it's important not to force yourself into empathy. If you can't access actual curiosity, then that's maybe not a time to give empathy. Maybe you need empathy first.
That's interesting. Why might you need empathy?
Well, the pain of your own unmet needs and the distraction of your reactive thinking may be blocking an ability to be curious about anyone else's experience.
That makes a lot of sense. I know for me as a practitioner of Chinese medicine, it's really easy for me to be curious about someone else's state when I'm in a clearly defined role of I'm there to listen and understand and help them. And yet I know I have that skill set, but when I go home and I am in a stressful conversation, perhaps with a loved one or a family member, then I really have to remember to put my own self-empathy hat on first, right? That I can't necessarily go there unless I recognize, am I ready to go there?
Yeah. So important.
So when you say people, they don't have the consciousness, does that mean that their own stuff is in the way so they can't be authentically curious about what's going on for someone else?
I think that's the most common obstacle. Yeah.
Okay. And what are ways that people can demonstrate empathy?
Yeah, that's the incredibly beautiful thing that compassionate communication provides, is a really simple way to offer empathy, which is what you alluded to, just to make a guess at someone's feeling or someone's need. That does require you to have a feelings and needs vocabulary, which is a little harder to acquire than some might imagine. But just a simple like, oh, are you sad about that? Or were you wishing for more support with that project? Those kinds of simple guesses really go a long ways towards helping someone have a sense of being seen and heard.
Especially because you can be wrong and the person will tell you immediately that you're wrong and just clarify it for you, which just makes conversations, it's a great short circuit of a lot of misunderstanding, I think.
Yeah. I think that's a big piece of the consciousness of allowing yourself to give empathy is like, oh, they're just guesses. You really don't have to know what anyone else is experiencing. That's why I say just bringing curiosity.
Mm-hmm. And what you just said about feelings and needs needing a particular vocabulary is critical. I really have appreciated a resource that comes from you and your website, the Feelings and Needs sheet that basically articulates just words of what it feels like when a given need is met versus unmet, and then the list of what those universal human needs are. Mm-hmm. And I had that on my refrigerator for about 2 years and would refer to it frequently because English is so blamey, right? We have all of these words that end in ed, which imply when you use them that someone else did this to you, so like I feel rejected. Well, that implies that someone intentionally rejected us, and that may not be what happened. Or I feel insulted, or I feel, like those aren't actually feelings. Those are words that sound a lot like feelings. And a counselor that I was working with at the time, her definition was like that a feeling is something that can arise by itself without anybody else around. And I kind of like that in terms of feeling like, okay, am I actually on to a feeling, or am I still in attributing motive to something which I can never really know?
Yeah, exactly. And often people will be happy for you to make those kinds of guesses, like, do you feel criticized? Do you feel harassed? And they'll be like, yeah, I do. Unfortunately, it tends to escalate reactivity rather than bringing us into our hearts and into a grounded place from which we might take wise action.
And speaking to needs and feelings is different?
Yeah, that's probably a more subtle point about empathy, is that with empathy, we're curious about someone's experience and we're attempting to connect with them where they are in their experience. So when you know someone really well, you've known them for years, it's easy to have the idea that you already know what they're experiencing, and then you're not actually coming from curiosity. You're moving maybe into analysis or telling. And so you're talking with your brother and his need for belonging comes up a lot. And so before his consciousness is there, you say, I think this is about your need for belonging. And because he's not living in that experience, it doesn't land as empathy for him. It lands as analysis or telling, or even an invasion of his world there. So you're guessing a need. If a need seems to be alive for the person, you're guessing the feeling that seems to be alive in that moment.
And that implies that you're actually listening to them.
Yeah.
And that you're there in the moment with them.
Yeah.
And you're guessing at what might be coming across. So are there ways that people think that they're offering empathy when really that's not what they're doing at all?
Yeah, empathy usually just gets lumped into a group of supportive actions, like I'll help you if I give you advice, I'll help you if I talk about how what you're going through affects me. That's sympathy. Cheerleading, seeing the silver lining to a tough experience. Those all might be helpful things in a given moment. They're just simply not empathy. And I often say that 99% of the time, we just want a moment of empathy before we want anything else, just to be seen and heard.
I think you're absolutely right about that. Or what comes to mind is, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Right? Somebody's saying something hard and you say, well, it depends on how it's delivered. I guess there's nothing wrong with the words I'm sorry, but
sure,
the words I'm sorry are different than offering empathy to me.
Yeah, you might be trying to express caring, and you're definitely revealing the impact on you. It's not the same as empathy. Yeah.
Yes. So are there phrases that people should add to their vocabularies, in your opinion, that are helpful for expressing empathy?
Well, we often say, when we're really learning this for the first time, we talk about classical giraffe, which is a metaphor we use. And so, are you feeling this because you need this is the most classical empathy phrase that we first learn with. And it's nice because it connects a feeling to a need. So that's important because needs is the place from which we can take action. The point of identifying a feeling is to be connected in your heart and connected with each other. But the point is not just to hang out and swim in a pool of feelings. Feelings lead us to the needs, which hopefully leads us to something we can do about those needs.
I really appreciate that idea of feelings pointing the way towards the unmet need or the value.
Or the met need.
Yeah, in both Buddhism as well as in Chinese medicine, which is informed by Buddhism as well as Taoism and Confucianism, we have this notion that emotions are definitely not the truth. They are in Chinese medicine, we think of them as qi, they're energy, but a lot of times it's not grounded. It's simply moving, and that's what it does, is it needs to move. And then the heart, which needs to feel and experience all the emotions, in order to be present, the heart needs to be empty. The heart needs to be not cluttered with a whole bunch of feelings in order for us to be clear and to perceive accurately. So the idea is that, there's nothing to elevate emotions to some high pedestal is not the point, but to follow the emotions to what might be a really important thing for someone to pay attention to.
Yeah.
That is actually really important.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the most common thing that is modeled for us, perhaps, is that emotions take us into our thoughts. We try to make meaning of those emotions, and that usually puts us in a cyclical form of reactive thinking, and it doesn't allow for clear action.
Exactly. And a lot of times, too, our bodies will still be coursing out the stress hormones, and it's the mind's job to make sense of what's going on. And so a lot of times, and for women, we take longer to come down off of that than men do. And so just knowing that after a conflict is resolved, it could still be tempting to make up a story or to layer on another reason why you feel this way, but it might actually be a better idea in terms of creating a compassionate connection with someone to take a break for 20 minutes until your amygdala hijack period ends.
Take a break and do something grounding. I think the second part is critical, because sometimes we say we take a break and we continue our reactive thinking.
Yeah. So what might be a grounding activity that someone could go towards?
Focusing on the needs list is a simple thing to do. Just really okay, this need was alive, this need was alive. Just that naming process really helps to bring that compassionate witness on board, brings mindfulness back. Also doing anything that is grounding in earth element, like going for a walk or eating or drinking. It's helpful. Laying on the ground in the grass or on the floor. I have a whole list of emotional regulation activities on my website.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah.
I will definitely leave a link to your website in the show notes for people to access easily.
Great.
One thing I'm curious about is if you are flooded in a conversation, is there something that you can do to offer empathy to yourself in the moment?
Yeah, simply beginning with naming that you're flooded is the hugest thing you can do. The moment you can do that, then you're just a little bit bigger than the flooding. So that really helps.
You're a little outside it.
Yeah, exactly. And then if you can name body sensations, that helps you to stay a little bigger than it. And it's also very grounding just to be in your body.
When that comes up, do you name it out loud or just to yourself?
Well, it depends on the person I'm with. Certainly with the people I'm closest to, that's kind of the culture that we've created in our relationships. We really respect that in each other. So I name it out loud, and that way the other person can pause and allow me to do self-empathy and regulation for myself.
I'm curious how you offer empathy when you don't agree with what someone is saying. This comes up to me sometimes as a parent when I can see perhaps the teacher's point of view or the other kid's point of view and my kid is sharing something with me, and I am tempted to want to make it a teachable moment and have them step outside of their experience and learn something. But I also am cognizant of the fact that I want to be a compassionate listener to my kid. And it's sometimes hard to walk that line. And I guess the way that I sometimes have done it is offer empathy first and then later on kind of revisit the issue and see if at that point the ability to look outside their own experience is possible. But let's say a friend is just going off on something and you can tell why it's triggering for her, but you don't necessarily see it the same way.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot to say there. If you are grounded in yourself, then you can allow your attention to land on what's most important for this person. And often I'll just be asking myself that question on the inside while they're talking. And while they do that, or while I do that, I should say, I'm also giving myself permission not to hear every word they say. A lot of us have been trained to listen for information. So listening with empathy is much different than that. We're not really listening for information as much as we're listening with our hearts to what's most important for this person.
And when you come from that space, when you're listening from your heart, it's much easier to guess what's going on for the other person.
Yeah, it really does become easy at that point.
Yeah.
And I'm also, if I'm not triggered, and so then I'm not pushed to take a stand on an issue, right, from my own reactivity, makes it pretty easy.
Yeah. So one thing that every close, intimate relationship needs is boundaries. And I work with a lot of people, especially women, who tend to feel, well, men too, but I think very culturally conditioned women are often in this culture the ones who feel guilty about setting a boundary because they don't want to disappoint someone. And there is this idea that women are supposed to put everyone else's needs first and that it's selfish to speak up for what they might want. And I feel like actually half my practice sometimes is helping people understand that self-care is not selfish.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'm interested in your perspective and how you might convince these people, myself included, that setting boundaries is actually an act of kindness and compassion.
Well, I would never hope to convince anyone of anything.
Okay.
But
how might you challenge that conditioned thinking that I think people actually come to on their own because they're resentful or there's something in them that is speaking out that gets that this pattern is no longer working for them and that something needs to shift. And I guess that's my answer to it, is that a lot of times what doesn't come out by setting a boundary proactively comes out sideways later in the form of resentment.
Yeah, I would say there's two basic roads to transformation. And one is you reach a critical mass of suffering, and that critical mass of suffering kind of wakes you up into a sense of clarity in which you no longer have to use willpower to keep yourself from doing that thing again. That is a really, really hard road to transformation. Now, the other option is that you have empowering and enlivening, supportive experiences of doing something new, right? So that you get it in your body that, when I do it this way, it really works, it's satisfying. So oftentimes when I'm teaching boundaries, I encourage folks to experiment with people that they already have a pretty supportive relationship with so that they can set a boundary and have a success. Set a boundary, have a success again and again, and start very small.
That sounds like good advice. What are some examples of boundaries that we could set?
Well, I think it's helpful to back up and define boundaries as we think of them in compassionate communication, or rather as I think of them.
Great.
For me, in compassionate communication, setting a boundary is really about discerning the way in which all needs can best be met in a given situation, and who will contribute what energy to getting those needs met. So underlying that is a really important principle that I think is an astounding gift from compassionate communication, which is we are incredibly self-responsible as adults. At least that's the hope. I work with couples a lot. So part of what can happen as couples is that they make these unspoken, implicit agreements that they're responsible for a particular set of needs for each other. And so NVC is saying, well, actually, you are responsible for noticing when a need is alive and then making a request about that need. And you're also responsible for having many, many ways to meet that need. So when I come forward, or when you come forward and make a request of me and I say no, then you can hear that easily because you know you have other ways to meet your need.
Yes, that your partner is not the only way to unlock that for you. You have multiple paths to the same point.
Yeah. And when I start to trust that in my partner, anyone in my life, like, oh no, they're responsible for their needs. And, it's really nice if they're skillfully responsible, and then they are a happy and thriving person. But even if they're not, I'm still not responsible for them figuring out how to do that. And it's not a service to them to try and do it for them. It doesn't contribute to their growth or evolution.
Exactly. Where I see this come up for people a lot is with respect to division of labor or time. That there is, for example, someone will want to talk and process their day at a time when the other person in the relationship is completely not in a space to hear that.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a temptation to want to bend that boundary because this is the time of day where connection might be possible, but it's not really ideal. And so then things get messy and sticky. And so I see people fall into that frequently. And being able to come up with an agreement about, okay, I want to connect with you, but I also really need some sleep right now. Or there's this other need that's coming up for me that is in conflict, and being able to then negotiate in a way that it's not personal. It's not about, I'm rejecting you right now. It's that I can't go there.
Yeah, and I think that brings up two critical pieces that makes boundary setting easier. One is that if you can learn to say no and still express your caring, that helps a lot. Because a lot of times we'll give up our own boundaries in order to express caring. Pay for it later, of course. Finding that way to keep your boundary and express that caring is super helpful. And the second one is what we said earlier, not getting attached to time, right? That
letting it happen later.
Yeah, that it doesn't happen. Your caring does not have to happen in a particular way at a particular time. Really learning that flexibility and trusting that needs can be met.
You said, of course, we'll pay for it later. I'm not sure that that's an of course for a lot of people. What do you mean by that?
Well, each time you give up your own boundary, it's like self-abandonment. So you pay for it in terms of your own relationship to yourself. You don't trust yourself to meet your own needs. And that then can lead to depression in worst cases. At the very least, it leads to often defensiveness, right? Because your relationship to your own needs is so tenuous that it's easy for you to be threatened by other people's actions or words.
Defensiveness. That makes a lot of sense. And you said if you can't trust your own,
relationship to your own needs?
If you can't trust your relationship to your own needs and that you will take care of your own needs.
Yeah, exactly.
Then, so if you're not on your own side, sticking up for yourself, there's a wall of like, I have to defend against the world because I'm vulnerable to it, because I can't count on me to intervene.
Yeah, and I have to keep myself away from anyone who might be a threat. I mean, you could see how it just spirals into...
That makes, yes.
Pretty contracted spaces, yeah.
Yeah, and hearing that those times where we do let somebody go on for 2 hours when we really only have the attention span for one, it's how draining that feels and how depressed, I think, is an apt word that you use. Like, yeah, it is a downward, heavy sort of a feeling that a lot of times people are left with.
Yeah, and if it doesn't lead to the depression, then it usually leads to anger and blame. You made me listen for 2 hours, that kind of thing.
Yeah, or that happens in an unspoken way. That in Chinese medicine, we think a lot in terms of yin and yang, right? So that the purpose of anger is to make us big, is to move energy upward and outward. And the reason for that is often when what we're feeling is actually downward and inward.
It's trying to pull us out of the floodwaters.
Yeah, exactly. What else do people need to know about boundaries?
I think it can be helpful just as a touchstone to really understand that your own thriving, your own well-being and self-care is the biggest gift you can give to others. There's nothing more healing, from my perspective, on our planet than someone who is resourced and whole. And just bringing that presence, whether it's through empathy or helping someone move, whatever it is, it's an incredible gift. So when you cross your own boundaries to express caring out of a form of desperation or fear of rejection or whatever it might be motivated by, you're really pulling that gift away from the world in the long term, right? And abandoning yourself, as we said before.
And yet it often seems so much the opposite. Like, this person needs me in this moment, and clearly the most kind thing I can do is to be there for them.
Yeah, I think that thought, it might be helpful when you have a thought like that to recognize that you're not in touch with the bigger picture of life, the bigger picture of the flow. Right? Maybe you don't take that phone call in that moment, and maybe your friend reaches out to someone else and forms a new channel of support. So I think having that humility and that don't know mind is so critical. We don't know the path for someone else.
Yeah. And when we get out of, for example, a codependent pattern of trying to meet someone else's needs, that perhaps there's a gift there, that they're able to find some strength, or, as you said, another channel of support that, yes, we don't know. We don't have the biggest picture possible.
Yeah, it's about trusting. And the more we cultivate this quality of connection that needs to be met with creativity and flexibility, the more trust we cultivate, the more flexibility we cultivate, and it's a positive circle.
I love that. That's beautiful. Circling back to the whole compassionate communication model for a second, the sentence, or the fill-in-the-blank sentence that's on top of the feelings and needs list, it's sort of the basic framework for compassionate communication, is basically you make an observation that's rooted in what just happened, and you connect that to a feeling and to a universal need, and then you make a request. Because if you don't make a request, the other person doesn't really know what to do with that. And so the request piece is there to open up a dialogue about a way of what it is that needs to change, or what it is you're needing, right? So make it a concrete,
how you might like to go forward.
Yeah, so it's a concrete and specific request that someone else can say yes or no to. And that by doing that, that sort of completes the jumping off point for having a compassionate conversation. And I just wanted to throw that out there for people who are wondering how to put this into practice, that can be a simple framework to start with. Is there anything that this is obviously exactly what you do for a living. Are there other sort of baby steps for people who might want to be putting some of these principles into practice that you can recommend?
Well, a couple things. Sometimes when people start working with NVC, they can get kind of mired down in the syntax, which you're referring to, that's at the top of my feelings and needs list. And some people really love the syntax, so if you love it, great. But to recognize that feelings and needs occur in a context. And so the observation is the most recent event that creates the beginning of that context. And the request is the second part of that context. So they're almost like bookends. Like they give feelings and needs a place to exist. So it's helpful to remember that there's just one bookend on one side and one on the other. What the mind wants to do is relate those feelings and needs to 100 other similar events. And then...
Parentheses, not mind map. Okay.
Yeah. They want to have a healing conversation about 100 events in one moment.
Not going to happen.
It doesn't work that way, unfortunately. It'd be nice if it did, because it'd be very efficient, I mean. With requests, the easiest ways to start a practice in learning how to make requests is to really notice the times when your needs are met. And then notice exactly what you did or said on the inside and the outside, and what someone else did or said that landed you in that joyful, satisfied, relaxed, whatever it is, place. That way, when that need isn't met, you have these concrete experiences to draw from as far as making a request.
So this feels great. What's going on here? And then using that as a template for kind of retrofitting when things aren't met.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. That's great advice.
And to remember that request is this incredibly, I find, beautiful form of self-responsibility. So a true request isn't imposing your needs on someone else. It's being responsible for what's alive in you in the moment.
Can you fill that out for us a little bit more?
Yeah. Especially in close relationships, we have a basic sense when something's up for someone else. And so when you choose not to communicate about that, the other person is put in a position of either offering you empathy, which might be fine. In the more reactive place, they may shut down or distance themselves, or they may try to take responsibility for you and kind of do this tap dance around trying to get it right for you to meet your need. Very exhausting scenario for that other person. Very hard on them. So when you are willing to come forward and first have the mindfulness and self-awareness to notice your own experience and the vocabulary to name it, and even to say, like, I have this need for warmth right now, but I just don't have any idea about how it would be met. You can make a request to have someone brainstorm with you about that request. The point is, you want to initiate that responsibility taking.
So that's letting someone know that you're in need of help and you're not sure quite how to go about solving your emotional need or meeting that need in the moment.
Yeah, it's okay to not know. What's not okay is to expect someone else to know automatically. Mm-hmm. Marshall Rosenberg, the founder of NBC, called that emotional terrorism.
Yeah. Right. Or simply leaving the request off. I'm feeling this way because I have a need for respect and and this is how it's connected and then not saying what the person could do to make it better.
Yeah. Probably one of the single most common things I hear myself saying to couples is, can you bring your attention to what you do want to happen rather than what happened that you didn't like?
And shifting to the solution finding or flipping into what does work for you instead of what doesn't.
Yeah. Some people call that living from the energy of the met need. Even when a need is unmet, we've likely had some experience of it being met. And if we remember that experience, that'll often open up creativity and a willingness to move forward into the next thing that will meet that need.
Wonderful. Well, LaShelle, I have really appreciated you taking the time to speak with us today.
Sure.
I'm wondering if people want to continue to learn from you and your wisdom, how can they stay in touch?
Yeah, you can check out my website. It's wiseheartpdx.org. And I have lots of free resources on there. I have many, many articles on there. And I also publish an article every week. It's called The Connection Gem. You can sign up for that. It takes a daily life situation and shows how to practice with it from this framework.
I am an avid reader of The Connection Gem, and it's fabulous. And I think having real life examples, first of all, it's great to know you're not alone in a lot of these things, but a lot of times it's super practical. I've found either in my own life or for people that I know. And so I often forward them on because they're great.
Oh, great. Thank you so much.
Again, thanks for taking the time to talk with us and to educate us a bit as to what compassionate communication is all about.
You betcha.
Thanks for listening today. For more episodes of A Healthy Curiosity, you can visit the iTunes store. If you appreciated today's show, please leave us a review. This helps other people to find the podcast. You could also head to brodiewelch.com, where you can find free self-care resources, learn more about Chinese medicine, and let me know what you'd like to hear about on future episodes. I'd love to hear from you. Till next time, be good to yourself.